Okay. All right, as we get started this semester, one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to international relations. One of the first things that we've got to do when we deal with international relations is actually we've got to have a good working definition of this. And what I'm going to do is actually go to page 2 of the textbook being International Relations, Perspectives, and Controversies. Down at the bottom of page 2, it says, and this is about 5 lines up, it says, we may be tempted to throw our hands up in frustration and define international relations as everything that goes on in the world. Okay, that's a little bit general. But the next line or the next sentence in this actually gives you a little bit better of a definition. Dealing with international relations, it says, international relations is the whole complex of cultural, economic, legal, military, political, and social relations of all states, as well as their component populations and entities. So basically what we're going to be talking about in international relations is we're going to be talking about things like culture, why different societies do certain things and how it interacts. We're going to be talking about politics. We're going to be talking about leaders and elections and dictators and things along these lines. Economics. This is where things like money and trade and oil are going to come into perspective. And as this definition says at the very bottom of page 2, we're going to start getting into populations and people as well. So with this in mind, international relations really does cover virtually everything that goes on in the world, but we can probably say it a little bit more specific, like the cultural, the political, the economic, the social, the population, and of course the actual government entities that are going to be interacting. Now with this in mind, letter B up here says history. There's 2 things that I want you to think about in terms of international relations regarding history. Number one, the current today is a product of the past. And what I mean by that, in chapter 1, as we get started, what you're going to see is that chapter 1 basically covers thousands of years in those 40 some odd pages. It covers thousands of years of world history. And what you'll see is that some of the same mistakes that they made hundreds or maybe even sometimes thousands of years ago, we are still making today. So with this in mind, we need to know a little bit about the history in terms of international affairs, about some of the wars, about some of the peaces, about some of the different conflicts or the different almost disastrous events, if you will, in order to put them into the context of today. Because those things that happened a long time ago affect things today, whether it be in the Middle East, whether it be in Eastern Europe, whether it be in China, for that example. The other thing that we've got to do, we've got to know a little bit about history because history repeats itself. So again, with this in mind, we're going to be going over and over and over. And you'll see out there that the United States itself, some people have compared the Iraq situation that we have today to Vietnam from several decades ago. In other words, some people might argue that we're making the same mistake or repeating the same mistake that we did in Vietnam with what's going on in Iraq. Lastly, I want you to think as you go through these things. There are 3 really important concepts up here: bias, explain, and predict. When I say bias, what I'm suggesting to you is that there's always going to be a certain bias in some of the textbooks that you read. There's going to be a little bit of a bias in terms of some of the articles that we look at. And I want you to be aware that sometimes the people that are talking are not objective, but they're trying to push a certain viewpoint. The second thing up here is explanation. By explanation, I want you, whether you're writing a paper, whether you're writing a midterm exam, whether you're dealing with a dehumanization assignment later on, I want you to explain to me what your ideas are. I don't want to have to read through something and say, what is he or what is she talking about, but be very clear with your explanations. Sometimes these are going to be really commonsensical explanations. Other times they're going to be a little bit more detailed. But always, an ex-girlfriend told me years ago, she said, Greg, she said, good papers aren't written, she said they're rewritten. And she also said there aren't good ideas and there aren't bad ideas, but there are supported ideas. Now, I know that all these years later, she's not quoting me, and it still kind of chafes me a little bit that I'm quoting her. But the bottom line is that make sure that you explain and support what you're saying. And then the last thing up here, predict. Ultimately, what you're going to see is that if history repeats itself, sometimes when things happen, you're going to be able to predict what happens next. And again, this is going to be dealing with those cultural elements, or these political elements, or these economic elements, or whatever encompasses international relations for that given issue. So with this in mind, if you're able to think critically about things, Understand maybe a bias or a certain objective that a writer has. If you're able to explain your ideas and support them, that's going to make them much, much stronger. And then finally, make sure that you kind of get a sense of being able to predict what's coming next, because that's something that will serve you well on exams, that's something that will serve you well on discussion boards, and maybe most importantly, that's something that's going to serve you in life. I will go ahead and stop this introduction there, and we'll pick up with Chapter 1 in just a second.